The Packard division of Studebaker Packard Corporation presents
Today, if you want to name the finest American luxury car ever built, most people will say Cadillac. But for the first half of the 20th century, that answer would have gotten you strange looks. Because for decades, there was one American automobile that stood above every other. It was the car of presidents and royalty, of Hollywood stars and industrial barons. It competed not with Cadillac, but with Rolls-Royce.
This brilliant new 53 Packard at medium car cost, plus 7 luxurious Packards for 1953.
More than
America's
a
new
later,
choice.
One of the most confident lines ever written by an American company. 4 words, ask the man who owns one. And then, in 1958, Packard stopped existing, not shrank, not merged into something bigger, stopped. The greatest luxury automobile in American history was simply gone, and the enormous Detroit factory where those cars were built stood empty and crumbling for the next 60 years. This is the story of the rise and fall of Packard, and by the end, I will show you the single deal that killed it. A deal in which a great company handed over its future without ever asking one simple question. Our story begins in 1899 in Warren, Ohio, with a wonderful bit of American stubbornness. 2 brothers, James Ward Packard and William Dowd Packard, bought themselves an automobile, one of the earliest cars built in America, made by a man named Alexander Winton, and they were not impressed. So James Packard did what irritated customers have done since the beginning of time. He went and told the manufacturer everything that was wrong with it. The story goes that Winton listened to all of this, and then told him, more or less, if you think you can build a better one, go ahead and try. He did. That same year, the Packard brothers built their first automobile, and they built it on a principle that would define the company for the next 50 years. Not the cheapest car, not the fastest car, but the best-made car in America. In 1902, James Packard wrote the line that would become the company's soul. When customers asked how good a Packard really was, the company refused to boast. It simply said, ask the man who owns one. Go find somebody who has one, and let him tell you. That is not advertising. That is a company so certain of its own quality that it is willing to let strangers do the talking. And here is the thing. For decades, it was completely justified. Because Packard did not just claim to be the best. It engineered its way there, year after year, and it did it 3 ways. The first was pure mechanical excellence. Packard was an engineering company before it was a luxury company. It built engines of remarkable smoothness and refinement at a time when most automobiles shook and rattled and broke down. It pioneered features that the rest of the industry would take years to catch up with, including, in 1939, becoming the first automobile manufacturer in the world to offer air conditioning in a car. The second was craftsmanship. In an era when a luxury car was judged by the quality of the materials and the handwork that went into it, Packard's bodies were considered the finest built in America. These were not merely expensive cars. They were beautifully made objects, and people who owned them tended to keep them for decades. And the third was something no marketing department can manufacture. Packard became the car of the American establishment. It was driven by presidents and by foreign heads of state. It sat in the garages of the men who owned the banks and the steel mills. Hollywood stars bought them. Around the world, if you wanted to announce that you had truly arrived, you did not buy a Cadillac. You bought a Packard. It was, quite simply, the American Rolls-Royce. And then came the Great Depression and the decision that saved the company and doomed it. When the economy collapsed in the 1930s, the market for very expensive handmade automobiles nearly vanished overnight. Rich men stopped buying. One after another, America's great luxury car makers went under. Packard faced a brutal choice. Hold the line on exclusivity and die with dignity, or come down the ladder and survive. In 1935, Packard came down the ladder. It launched a car called the 120, a genuinely good automobile, but a mid-priced one, selling for under $1,000. And it worked spectacularly. Production tripled that year and doubled again the next. 2 years later, the company went even further down market with a 6-cylinder model. Packard survived the Depression, while its luxury rivals were being buried. But something had been quietly traded away. Because up until then, the whole value of the name rested on one idea: not everybody can have this. And now, quite a lot of people could. The middle-class family down the street had a Packard in the driveway now, and it was a fine car, but it was not a different species from other cars anymore. Packard had saved its life by spending its Mystique, and nobody would send the bill for 20 years. Then came the Second World War, and for a moment Packard's real character came shining back through. When the Allies needed engines for fighter aircraft, Packard was chosen to build the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, under license the engine that powered the Mustang fighter. Packard also built the engines that drove American patrol torpedo boats. The company that made the smoothest luxury cars in America turned out to be one of the finest precision engine builders in the world. It came out of the war with an outstanding reputation and a great deal of money in the bank. And by every appearance, in 1946, Packard was in superb shape to reclaim its throne. But the decade that followed would take it apart, piece by piece. The fall of Packard came from 3 directions, and the third one was self-inflicted. The first force was that Packard fell behind, mechanically, in the one area where it had always led. After the war, the American automobile industry changed almost overnight, and the new symbol of power was the V8 engine. Cadillac introduced one in 1949. Even small, cash-strapped competitors had one by the early 1950s. Packard, the great engineering house, the builder of Merlins, did not have a modern V8 until 1955. For 6 critical years, the finest engineering company in America was selling an engine design that dated back to before the war, and customers noticed. The second force was the price of a diluted name. Remember, the 120. By the 1950s, Packard was trying to sell genuinely magnificent luxury cars at the very top of the market, and it was trying to sell them under a badge that ordinary families had been driving for 20 years. Meanwhile, Cadillac had spent that same period being nothing but Cadillac. When a buyer with real money went shopping in 1953, the aura had migrated. Packard was still a fine car, but it was no longer the answer to the question of what a successful man drove. And the third force was a decision made years earlier to save money, one that came back and closed its hand around the company's throat. To cut costs, Packard had stopped building its own automobile bodies and contracted the work out to an outside supplier. Then, in 1952, Chrysler bought that supplier and agreed to keep supplying Packard for only 2 more years. Think about what that means. One of the great manufacturers in America suddenly discovered that a rival now controlled its ability to produce cars on a clock. Packard was forced to scramble into a different factory and rebuild its body-making operation from scratch, an enormously expensive, enormously disruptive emergency, at the exact moment it could least afford one. So by 1954, here is where the great Packard Motor Car Company stood. Behind on engineering, a name that no longer commanded the top of the market, and a manufacturing crisis unfolding in real time. The company brought in a determined new chief executive named James Nance, a marketing man who understood exactly what had gone wrong and wanted to make Packard a pure luxury brand again. But he needed scale to survive against General Motors and Ford. And so he did what desperate companies do. He went looking for a partner. The plan, on paper, was reasonable. The idea circulating in Detroit was that America's remaining independent automakers should combine into one company big enough to fight the giants. And so in October of 1954, Packard purchased Studebaker, the automaker down in South Bend, Indiana, forming the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. Packard would have volume. Studebaker would have a luxury flagship. Together, they would survive. There was only one problem. Nobody had checked whether Studebaker's numbers were real. Packard's board did not demand an independent audit of Studebaker's books before completing the deal. Read that sentence again, because it is the whole story. One of the most respected manufacturing companies in America bought another manufacturing company and did not verify the figures it had been given. And the figures were catastrophically wrong. During the negotiations, Packard had been told that Studebaker needed to sell roughly 165,000 cars a year to break even. After the deal closed, Packard's chief financial officer sat down with the actual accounts, and by one account came back from South Bend ashen-faced. The real break-even point was not 165,000 cars. It was around 282,000 cars a year. And how many cars had Studebaker actually sold that year? Roughly 82,000. Sit with that arithmetic for a moment. Packard had just bought a company that needed to sell nearly 3.5 times as many cars as it was actually selling, simply to stop losing money. Studebaker's plants were old, its assembly was slow, and it was plagued by labor stoppages. One executive would later describe the whole merger as two drunks leaning on each other for support. And a week after the purchase closed, the industry veteran who had championed the grand plan to unite the independents died, and his successor wanted nothing to do with it. So the larger vision that had justified the entire deal evaporated almost immediately. Packard had not found a partner. It had chained itself to an anchor, and every dollar that should have gone into the new cars that might have saved the brand now went instead into covering Studebaker's losses. And the terrible part is that Packard's engineers came so close anyway. For 1955, they finally delivered everything the company had needed for a decade. A powerful new V8, a sophisticated new automatic transmission, and an ingenious suspension system that gave the cars a ride the competition could not match. Reviewers were impressed. For one brief moment, it looked as though Packard might come roaring back, but there was no money left to do it properly. The cars were rushed, and they were built in that hastily converted factory. The company had been forced into where the bodies did not fit correctly, and the quality problems came off the line one after another. The very brand, whose entire identity was "Ask the Man Who Owns One Now," had owners with cars that rattled and leaked. Word spread. Dealers lost their nerve. The following year, sales fell off a cliff down roughly 2/3 in a single year. By 1957, it was over in every way that mattered. The company could no longer afford to build a real Packard, so the last cars to wear the name were not Packards at all. They were Studebakers with different trim, assembled in Indiana cars that collectors today refer to, with a certain sadness, by a nickname that mashes the two names together. The great mark that had once stood beside Rolls-Royce was reduced to a badge on somebody else's automobile. And in 1958, they stopped even doing that. Packard was finished. What was left behind became one of the most haunting sights in America. The vast Packard plant on Detroit's East Grand Boulevard, a pioneering industrial building, once among the most advanced factories in the world, sat abandoned for decade after decade. Its windows shattered, trees grew through its floors, and it became the single most photographed ruin in Detroit, a symbol of everything the American century had built and then walked away from. Only in recent years has demolition finally begun, but the cars themselves survived. Packards are treasured today, restored and shown and driven by people who understand exactly what they are. And the slogan endures. If you go to a classic car show this summer and find a gleaming Packard on the grass, you can still do what the company invited America to do more than 100 years ago. You can ask the man who owns one. So what do we take from all of this? There are business lessons here about brand dilution, and about outsourcing something essential, and about falling behind on the thing you were once best at. But for me, the lesson that stays is the deal itself. Here was a company whose entire identity, for 50 years, was built on rigor, on measuring things precisely, on refusing to accept a part that was not right. Packard built the engines that flew in fighter aircraft because the country trusted it to get every tolerance exactly correct. And that same company signed away its future by taking another man's numbers on faith and never checking them. Packard did not die because Americans stopped wanting beautiful cars. It died because in the single most important decision in its history, nobody in that room asked the plain, unglamorous question that any careful person asks. Are we sure these figures are true? Because that is the truth these stories keep teaching us. Companies almost never fail at the thing they are famous for being good at. They fail at the ordinary thing, the boring thing, the question so simple that everybody in the room assumed somebody else had already asked it. Now, I would love to hear from you. Did your family ever own a Packard, or do you remember seeing one come down the street when you were young? Leave a comment below and tell me about it. And if this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe, because here on this channel, we tell these stories one at a time. After all, every empire has its rise, and every rise has its fall.